Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Congressman John Shimkus and discuss the federal budget, the terrorist attack in France, new House Speaker Paul Ryan, and the progress of improving Illinois' locks and dams. This runs about 35 minutes.
Congressman John Shimkus, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
It's great to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
There's an awful lot to discuss, a lot of news obviously been happening both domestically and internationally, but let me just start opening question. As you look to run again in 2016 for another term, what are the issues that you're looking to focus on?
Yeah, let me first talk about the district. It's 33 counties. It stretches from Danville down to Kentucky and from the Illinois-Indiana line all the way to the Metro St. Louis area. You know, we have 4 local offices, and the untold story of what a good member or a good representative does is really makes themselves available to their constituents, and also what we call constituent services, casework on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, disability issues, Veterans Affairs, immigration issues. And so, you know, the untold story is the great work we can do for the people of that district. And then the other part of the job is the public policy, and where you're also listening to constituents, but also dealing with a lot of the legislation that moves. The world continues to be a very dangerous place, so the timely debate right now is ISIS and the Paris attacks and our own national security and immigration, or resettlement of Syrian refugees. Also on how do we respond? Do we now get some leadership? Do we get a plan? You know, our position is we're in this mess because we really haven't had leadership. The United States hasn't exerted itself on the international stage. We've kind of stepped back, and the void has been filled by Islamic jihadists, and they are chopping off people's head. I mean, I think this is an era that we thought was long gone in the world, and now it's fully displayed on mass media. So that has consumed a lot of our time recently, and in fact over the last 10 days, with votes occurring on the Syrian refugee issue, and saying, let's have a pause, let's make sure we know who they are before the president continues to move and resettles a whole bunch of Syrian refugees.
And I was going to get into that, so let's just on that issue, what's your position?
Well, I voted to pause. I voted, and there's really 2 issues. One is our national security folks, really the State Department, our FBI director says, we can't be assured of who's coming in. So that just, out of abundance of caution. And the other debate is, we can, the international community can, settle them, protect them, and then have them in a position to move back into their home. So, I mean, do we really want a depopulation of maybe Syrian Christians or moderate Muslims from that area, so that it's just totally in control of the radical Islamist state that is a safe haven? So if they are spread throughout the Western world, my guess is they're not going to come back. So how do you bring moderation back to that area? So those are 2 reasons that I supported the resolution that was on the House floor. It was a veto-proof majority. So we had enough, not just Republicans, but enough Democrats that said we should pause this and make sure that we know who's coming across.
Have you thought, speaking of, where would you keep them or where would you hold them in the meantime?
Well, there's no difference than what happened in Iraq, where you had the northern no-fly zone, and we protected the Kurds, right? So that's the ability of the international community to be able to do that. So I'm sure our Western neighbors, and even Turkey and Greece, and those people that are trying to deal with this flow would love to be able to have a safe haven location and a no-fly zone that they're protected and prepared to move home when whatever ground war occurs. And that talks to boots on the ground, and it talks to boots on the ground by an international community.
And recently also, everyone knows who follows politics, we have a new Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, who was a vice presidential candidate 4 years ago or so. How well do you know Congressman Ryan, and what are your thoughts?
I know Paul pretty well. Speaker Ryan, we're all getting used to saying that, and he's been a member, although he looks a lot younger than me and more physically fit and, you know, younger kids. He's been a member quite a long time too. So I'm going into my, ending my 19th year, going to my 20th, and I would say he's been a member 14, 16 years. He is a policy guy. He's an individual who does politics so he can be in the room on policy. He's one of these guys that sleeps in his office, and when he's in DC, he's working around the clock. And right now, he's doing well. I think.
Let's just go a little bit behind the scenes aside from him. What's going on with the Republican caucus in the Congress and the divisions, and why was it that people were pleading for Paul Ryan to be the speaker because it seemed like no one else was going to be acceptable?
Yeah, well, it's the curse of abundant riches. You know, we've got 247 Republicans now.
Which is like the largest number of Republicans in the House since like the 1920s or something.
1928, that's right. So when you have such a large group, you have a big tent with diverse views. Republicans are the conservative party of our country, so now what is the definition of conservatism? Where do you need to be on that scale? We do have a lot of folks who are really are continuing to push our national debt, our budget deficit. What is the role of government constitutionally? How far have we moved away? I would say we've moved pretty far away. But how do you reclaim the constitutional principles without really totally disrupting, the way government has promised to provide services over decades?
It's interesting to looking at Republican politics, as you are mentioning, you have the social conservatives, you have the economic conservatives, and then you have Donald Trump, which I don't know how one would even classify him. Well, we'll come back to that. How do you classify yourself, or how do you think of yourself, and to what extent, when you approach issues, how do you approach them?
Well, I'm a governing conservative. I'm a social conservative. My votes are there. I'm pro-life. We look forward to the Senate when we get back passing what we call the reconciliation bill, which promotes some more defunding of Obamacare, but also addresses the Planned Parenthood issue and defunding. We hope to get that to the desk. We passed that out of the House. I'm also a fiscal conservative. I voted against the last budget agreement, which raised the debt limit again to about, it's at 18.5 trillion. It'll be 20 in 2017. It also broke the spending caps. There was also an ag insurance thing that I didn't like in that process. So by any standard, even how people would talk to me and view me in Washington, I'm a conservative socially and fiscally, and that's the district I represent. And I think the positions I had when I first ran are the positions that I've been able to hold true to over my tenure, and the positions I'll continue to. You followed me for a long time, so I don't think I've changed too much.
Relative to, let's talk about the budget a bit. I think a lot of people want Congress, they want the state, but they want Congress to get a hold of our budget. Now, Paul Ryan's an expert on the budget, so we'll see how his leadership impacts things. But you have 60% of the budget or so growing on automatic pilot with entitlements. You have the national debt at something like 7% of the overall budget. That's going to grow just as the Fed starts to raise interest rates. With 60% of the budget growing on automatic pilot, and all of those programs are the so-called third rail that you're in political danger if you touch them, how do we ever get a handle on spending?
Yeah, I think the untold story is over the past 2 years that we started touching the mandatory spending programs. We did it really last year under the thing we called the doc fix, which was this sustainable growth rate of doctors. We had set that in 97, 98 budget cycle, and then we couldn't maintain it, so we tweaked Medicare to help pay for that. We also did part of it in this budget agreement. We've done some with retirement plans in the last defense authorization bill for soldiers, 20-year soldiers, and how they're going to get paid and compensated. So
How does that work? I mean, that's not
Which
some of
on the military one?
the doctrix?
The doc fix?
Is it no.
Doctor.
Doctor fix.
Doctor fix. This is SGR, survival growth rate.
How does that cut spending?
Well, it adjusts actuarially the Medicare payment system to help fund that, but also bring, after the 10-year budget window, more money back. I'm not saying it's done everything to fix the 60%, but the fact that we are addressing mandatory spending and promises to pay future generations, either on Medicare or whether it's dealing with military retirement, we are touching them. And I think that provides some comfort that we've got a chance to do more in the future.
We're going to have to do a lot more, right?
Yeah, but you just said it used to be a third rail. We wouldn't touch it. Our argument is we are touching it now. We're finding
I'm not saying it critically, but as a practical matter,
have to.
I just want the public to understand.
No, you're right.
Because some of them think, you know, if we just cut out the silly funding of rainforest museums, then that's not going to do anything.
No, you have to actually make changes in the major mandatory spending programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest payments on our debt. As you said, it's 60% of all our spending. So the budget fights, when we have a government shutdown, which we don't think we're going to have this cycle, right? Or next cycle, because we have budget numbers now established, we're really fighting over a small percentage of the actual spending.
It's like 19% of discretionary spending.
33, depends on how you're moving the numbers, but you're right, by far, the biggest part of the spending is the mandatory. It's on automatic control, and unless we actually make the changes. I mean, the whole debate, everybody knows the debate. Social Security, established, people thought.
What can we do about Social Security? Do you have your own ideas on that? Or?
Yeah, you actually make changes. You're going to have to maybe do means testing for to the uber wealthy, right? How do you define uber? That's big.
So that those who basically don't need a paycheck from the government because they're financially set wouldn't get it.
Yeah, should be a safety net program, just like Medicare. And the other thing is, you actually can start making changes about retirement age. And maybe, especially for people maybe in the mid 25 to 45, and say, hey, you're going to have to work till you're 77. You're going to have to start doing those tweaks.
Now, you throw that out, but it's going to be set at a higher level. For myself and probably you, it's going to be in the neighborhood of about 67 under current law.
Under current law. It's
and we would move it north of that, which would save hundreds of billions of dollars.
You're not going to be able to address our age group.
No, we're talking really, just to be clear, as you just said, in people who are at least 20 to 25 years away from that age group. We're not going to pull the rug out of those who are nearing retirement.
It's the same thing we just did with military pensions.
And what did you do with that?
What we did was lower the rate of return on a pension payment by the government to 20-year folks. We replaced it with part of the money to go to a 401k and also a buy-in like a thrift savings plan, which we have at the federal level. So soldiers can get a thrift savings plan. We're going to put money into it. They can put their own money in. And then the argument is, upon 20 years, they're going to have more money because some of that money is going to go into a thrift saving plan type of operation. But that starts January 2018 for new enlistees. New people entering will have a little bit different retirement program, and that's saving a lot of money, because now in the military system, pension and healthcare benefits for retirees are consuming so much of the really operation and maintenance budget of our armed services. And in this day and age, and how dangerous the world is today, we have to have our soldiers, the force structure strong enough. They got to be trained highly, and they have to have the equipment to address these new threats.
Right, and defense spending as a percent of the budget has continued to fall for decades. I think it used to be 50% under President Kennedy. It's now at about 15%. And what most people, as you just alluded to, don't realize, they think of the defense spending as being all bombs and tanks, and a great deal of it goes to health care and pensions.
And salaries.
The Defense Department is the one area of the budget, just for the people to know, that contains its pension funding in the Department of Defense, where the Ag Department does not have that within their budget. Right. And I think the pension is something as much as 10% of the defense budget. I don't know the current number, but It's a sizable portion of it.
It's a sizable portion, but it's, the way it addresses now is when we talked about that 40% or 33% or 28% of the discretionary budget, that small part, half of that is military. Half of the discretion spending is military. Half
Isn't it debatable if defense spending is we say it's discretionary, but are we going to do away with the defense budget?
No, but it is. I mean, it is when we pass a budget process, and the other ones are mandatory. That is part of the. Every year we have
how
an
much you're going to
authorization.
spend.
Every year we actually vote on what we're going to put into the pot to spend for our military.
Now, didn't the president vetoed the defense authorization bill? Didn't he? Did he recently then sign a revised version?
He did. Now, that talks about the budget fight and why there was an agreement. Remember, that budget agreement was done when Speaker Boehner was still the Speaker, so it wasn't under Paul Ryan's watch. That was part of that.
That was one of the last things that Speaker Boehner did.
One of the last things Speaker Boehner did, try to, for a lot of reasons, but also to give Speaker Ryan a fresh start. So the president, we had passed a budget to meet our military and our defense needs. Primary responsibility of the federal government is to protect our citizens against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we do that through an authorization bill and a fully funded appropriation bill for our military. That means if we wanted to keep budget caps, we had to cut money in some of the other federal agencies, Department of Labor, EPA, Department of Commerce, and the president and Harry Reid in the Senate said, we are not going to address any budget bill unless you put more money in these other federal agencies. And they didn't. They didn't pass a single bill through the Senate. For a bill to become a law, it has to go through both chambers and the president has to sign it. That was the nexus or the fulcrum point of why we had a budget agreement. We had to, we knew we had to support our military. A lot of Republicans were saying we need more money for that. We had Democrats saying we need more money for these other agencies. That was really the compromise that was struck.
I know people listening to this will think these issues aren't sexy, but I will say they're extremely important, all these issues that we're talking about, and getting the federal budget back under control. And when you're talking about the soft spending, in other words, the pensions, the health care issues, that's where so much of the money is going in one form or another.
Well, when you're deficit spending, even when you think you're doing a good budget, when you're still deficit spending of $250 to $300 billion, that's money that adds to the national debt. That national debt is either owned by individual citizens through U.S. treasuries or savings bonds, or by foreign countries like China or other Canada, countries that are buying our debt. They're actually buying our debt to help and giving us dollars in essence so that we can spend more than we take in. It's just not a good equation.
I don't want to jump around too much. So speaking of defense. And let's go for a minute, because you've been a former military guy, you're a West Point graduate, so and you've done some traveling through Europe, and what do you think vis-a-vis where we are on terrorism and now the threat? And it seems as if the nations of like Belgium right now is under a lockdown. The attack on Paris and the French, who were, I think, for years a little bit weak on some of these issues. Maybe Europe is reawakening to the need for a strong defense and the threat that they face. How does that fit in your mind with our commitments under the NATO treaty? And there's this argument about whether we should now say, okay, let's do Article 5 and launch an all-out group effort to defeat ISIS and the terrorist threat.
Yeah, I've been disappointed with the French. I thought they would immediately go to the North Atlantic Council, which are the ambassadors of the NATO treaty aligned countries, and say, just like we asked in September 11th, hey, we were attacked, this should have a NATO response, and boom, all the countries said yes. What I forgot, or what I didn't know, is that country has to go before the North Atlantic Council and say, invoke Article 5. Attack on one is an attack on all. The French have not done that. The French they have gone to the EU. They have some offshoot of a military planning cell, I would say, and so now the Prime Minister of France is negotiating with Russia. Maybe he'll go to President Obama and maybe through the EU exert some desire to have some united efforts to attack. I think that's unfortunate. I think it's foolhardy. I think the strongest military alliance that has kept the peace in Western Europe, and Europe now, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They're is filled with strong allies, and that would be the better place to go. So we're watching to see how this unfolds.
Not to spend all the time on terrorism, but let's look at the Gitmo, and I should have brought this up when we talked about the defense and authorization bill. I believe that under that, the president, or Gitmo, is going to remain open, even though the president says he still wants to close it. That's the basic Guantanamo Bay where we hold the terrorist detainees. I presume you want to keep Guantanamo Bay open as an option? And
better there than on the continental United States. Look at these local attacks now, and we've had this fight over the past 5 or 6 years when there was a desire or hope that maybe they would come to the state of Illinois. We fought strongly against that. The defense authorization bill makes it clear that the president can't do this. We know examples where the president has thought he's had authority where we think legally he has not. His new attorney general has said this would be against the law if the administration, his administration would do this. But we're all waiting to see what this president will or will not do, because there's cases where he has used his executive branch to not comply with the law.
yeah, executive power. A lot of people think he's overreaching. How do you control as a legislative body? I mean, if a president wants to take executive action, what can you do about it?
Well, executive action is really designed about the power behind a law that then the president, as the chief executive officer, he has to enforce and roll out and figure out how the agencies are going to do that. When the law is very vague, gives him more running room to say, well, I can do this, I can't do this. The Gitmo debate is basically he is responsible for running federal prisons, either military and so his argument is going to be the legislators can't tell me how to move prisoners around. We think the law is pretty clear that in the case of Gitmo, they cannot be brought to the United States. But I've been in a lot of committee hearings where the people who wrote the law said this was the intent, and across the table the administration official says, but our attorneys read the law to say this. And that, so the real response is, I think, what we did in the defense authorization bill. Clearly define what the intent of the law is in the law itself. Don't keep it vague, but clearly, so there's not enough running room for the president to use the executive office.
I presume as a member of Congress you get some security briefings?
Yeah, we get some. Most of us joke that it's, if we just stayed on the World Wide Web and, did the regular media, we would be informed about as much as...
I suppose if you're on the Intelligence Committee you get some in-depth, but...
Much more in-depth,
yeah.
Much more in-depth, yes.
Let's move to some domestic issues. Just one of the issues, there's these interesting acronyms. One of them is WOTUS, which is the Waters of the United States. And speaking of the EPA that you mentioned before, the EPA, some would say, is on a power grab as a bureaucracy that they want to extend their reach. And they're going to say, hey, if we got a heavy rain and water sits in a field, all of a sudden we're going to say that's navigable waterways and we control that. What's going on with the EPA vis-a-vis what they're trying to do is in expanding their control of navigable waterways, and what can you do to balance the growth of that bureaucratic power?
Well, a lot of people don't realize that we've cut until this last budget. The caveat is, and we had cut the EPA's budget 30% over the last 5 years. Part of that is using the power of the purse to start depriving some of these agencies that we think, like the EPA, that's gone too far. Waters of the U.S. is a perfect example. Trying to define what waterways that they have should have some control over, because constitutionally, the inland waterway system and like the Mississippi, the Ohio, that's a purview of the federal government, because you don't want states damming up the Ohio River on one end and the other. So that's the Corps of Engineers. They want to reach into the tributaries, and the question is, as an old military guy looking at a map, when you have a little dotted blue line, that means an intermittent stream. An intermittent stream means sometimes there's water in it, sometimes there's not. I would argue that that's not navigable. It's navigable by your boots on your feet, but it's not navigable by some type of vessel. And the Constitution really only said that the federal government has control over navigable rivers, and that's where they've gone way too far, and that's where we have to continue. So in this omnibus bill that's coming forward, there'll be a prohibition that will say no federal dollars can be used to implement waters of the U.S. through the EPA, and that will be one of those quote-unquote riders that you hear about. Now, it's only good for the fiscal year. You'd rather do an authorization bill, put it into the law, which we've passed numerous times, but again, a law has to be signed by the president.
So, put the kibosh on it until October of next year, I guess.
Correct.
And then you may or may not be able to extend it. It'll probably sounds like something that'll be carried over into the next administration.
Well, we keep defunding it while we can through the budget battles, and then hopefully do an outright prohibition in a law signed by the next Republican president.
Have you? Well, let me jump in. I was going to get to that, but since you mentioned that, are you backing anybody for president?
I am not. There's still too many out there for me. So it's been very interesting, though, and I've enjoyed the intensity and really the crowds that are really appearing for a lot of candidates.
What do you think, as someone who has spent a lot of time at the federal level? Does it matter if you have government experience? I mean, we have two of the leading candidates, Trump and Dr. Carson, who have not had any political experience. Does that matter?
The Constitution says 35 years old, be a U.S. citizen, naturally born, be a resident of the country. Doesn't say that you had to have political experience. So I stand on the Constitution.
So I inserted that since you brought it up, but let me go back to one other water issue, and that is the lock and dams along the Mississippi. North of St. Louis, the river is too shallow to move barge traffic unless you have locks and dams to raise the water level.
Right.
The locks and dams we have are 70 years old. They, I think, were built to last maybe 40 or 50 years. Are we doing anything to get the funding to rebuild those?
Well, that's it's really one of the disappointments of my time in Washington. Although last year or 2 years ago we did pass the authorization bill,
which is not an appropriation bill. That just means you can spend the money, but doesn't mean they have the money. What about an appropriation?
Well, first of all, the bill is worded. People can look at it, Water Resources Development Act. It's not just lock and dams, but it's also levees and the like. Mm-hmm. And then you have to go through the appropriation cycle to spend the money. Now,
it's easy for people to get confused. One just says you have the legal authority to spend the money. The other is an appropriation bill, which says here's the check.
Yeah, but it also,
we don't have the check in the mail right now.
Well, but it also says for the operators agreed to get an increase in their taxes,
tolls,
so that you would have money that would go directed to that. Part of the Water Resources Development Act is there's a big lock and dam being built on the Ohio. We're almost pretty close to the confluence between the Ohio and Mississippi, called Olmsted Lock and Dam, and it's been a disaster and a money pit. So we're to help get that off the budgetary items, free up money to start doing these other projects, and Olmsted will get done. But it's an embarrassing story of poor planning, poor execution, and it's one of those things that now you have to finish because you've sunk so many dollars in it.
Mm-hmm. I see. Before we leave, and again, as we stay somewhat on the EPA and let's say regulatory issues, we also have what some say is a war on coal. The president, I guess, is still going to Paris for this international conference on controlling the emissions into the atmosphere. You come from a number of the counties you have are very reliant on coal. So what are your thoughts as far as changing, raising the regulatory or the regulations on coal and the use of coal, and the impact that may have on the economy in your area?
Elections have consequences. The president promised he would do this before he got elected in an editorial board meeting with the San Francisco Chronicle. He says, we're just going to make the using of coal so expensive that people are going to walk away from it. There is a war on coal. It was part of his agenda. It's unfortunate because he's from Illinois. It's unfortunate that politically, as a senator, he promoted coal and a thing of coal to liquid operations. But now, because of his position, it's an all-out assault. We just had another coal mine in my district announced closure. I have a power plant that's announced closure in Wood River. If a power plant is not using coal, then the contracted coal mine has lost their major, contract. So, and then you think about the devastation to a family. So much that now you have liberals saying, "Oh yeah, there's really is devastation. We should develop a federal program for these folks." Well, the federal program should be, let's keep them employed. I mean, do you think these miners want to be on the government welfare program? No, they want to be mining mines. You think these power plant operators want to be on a federal entitlement program? And no, they want to be operating the most reliable source of electricity at the lowest cost, and that trickles down to the manufacturing sector. That trickles to the family homeowner if you got low-cost power. So this is a devastating attack on manufacturing and jobs in our country, and we can't wait for this president to leave office.
Well, and recently, after delaying the decision for about 6 years, he said no to the Keystone Pipeline. Does that put the end to that, or do you think that might be brought back to the table?
We have every expectation that under a Republican administration, an approval will occur for Keystone XL. Remember, there's already a Keystone. There's already a pipeline that's bringing oil sands, oil from the oil sands of Alberta, Canada, about 800,000 barrels a day into Illinois.
And
Illinois benefits.
Yeah.
It comes into the Wood River. It goes to the Patoka Tank Farm. It goes up to Chicago. It goes to Indiana. It goes to Illinois. This was just another larger transportation system. So now we're going to have it come through the rail system, which sometimes may not be what people would like either. But I know pipelines is the safest, most secure, the least costly way to move bulk liquid products, and it's embarrassing that this administration stopped that.
Well, in fact, when we air this interview, we'll be pairing it with our interview with the Canadian Consul General, and we also talk about that issue. So, as he says, I mean, one of the reasons that we have so much trade with Canada is because of the oil that does come in Illinois.
Right.
Before we close out, you were first elected in 1996. You, I think, for the first time ever, have a opponent for the primary.
Right.
I believe, I haven't analyzed both your positions, but he's also a conservative, so you probably are not too far apart as far as your policy positions. I think his primary contention is that 20 years is enough, that you will
Right.
been running, and people may remember when you first ran, you said you would run for 3 terms and then stop.
Right.
Why, after 20 years, should you be reelected?
Well, in Washington, D.C., seniority is very, very important. I'm going to get a chance to be chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and it takes it takes that long just to be in the window. But listen, we addressed this issue 10 years ago. I went before my constituents and said, "Hey, I'd like to serve. What do you think?" They said, "Run again." And then since that time, I've had 5 more elections. So I think I asked for forgiveness for the statement. I think they've forgiven me by returning me 5 more times. We're Republicans. We believe in competition. Competition makes us stronger. It helps me reevaluate who I was when I first ran, and look in the mirror and say, is that still the same guy? Same issues, same positions, same passion, and I think the answer is yes. So I'm very excited about going through the primary campaign getting through the general, and then getting to Washington to try to make sure we're more secure, not less secure, that we have a growing economy, that we have energy security, and then we gotta have a healthcare system that can really provide a healthcare coverage that's affordable and transportable for American citizens. So I'm all pumped up, and I think a primary just helps me get motivated.
All right. Well, Congressman Shimkus, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.